What makes a NFT project successful? Is that actually the utility? Because I don't see a lot of like top project have much of a utility until recently, right?
I think it's a sense of belonging for many people. I think we do have to remember in today's world that a sense of belonging really is missing for a lot of people.
Hey, friends, welcome to Smart Venture Podcast, the best information for future CEOs. Starting a company is easy, but growing and managing it is hard. In this podcast, we sit down with the best founders, experienced leaders, and investors in tech and relevant space to give you the best tips to grow your company and grow yourself. Some of our most popular episodes are about crypto founders and investors. Don't forget to subscribe and give it a 5-star. This episode is brought to you by Momento NFT. Momento NFT is a direct-to-fan social NFT app that allows fans to own viral moments from their favorite creators and unlock perks like meet and greets, autographed merchandise, and more. As a creator, you can easily create valuable images and video NFTs of your best social content. And as a fan, you can own viral moments from your favorite creators and unlock perks like meet and greets. Momento NFT is backed by Animoca brand Denza and Mark Pincus. Check out the app available on App Store and Google Play.
You've been literally in like every iconic tech company ever, work on like the most just like iconic tech products. To name a few, it's just like, Spotify, Meta, Twitter, Google. Like I literally cannot name a company that you did not join. Like that's like a top tech company. But anyway, so to start off the show, I would love for the audience to learn a little bit more about you beyond the resume, right? Like you started your career in Illinois, like you started your PM career in Illinois, and like now to the VP of OpenSea. Do you want to share a little bit more about like your side of things on how you kind of get to where you are?
Yeah, sure. Let me start with like many people now, I think have a good idea of like what they want to do and that even product is a role, right? And when I was starting out my career, I don't think I had a very good idea that the types of things that I was most interested in actually was a job I could get. And so, like
Mhm.
many, and probably many of the people in the audience too, I started out primarily by just volunteering and doing things that like motivated me. And sometimes I was really bad at something. And so I would be asked to do something else that ended up being my passion. So for example, I started out as an intern effectively doing biomedical research in computational biology. I was basically the worst researcher in the organization. So what they said is like, hey, why don't you figure out how to get this stuff on our website and then maybe launch it as an app and reach out to
Mhm.
biologists around the world. And that's something that I jumped into and I got really excited by it, and it only took me 5 years later to realize that could be a job. So
Mhm.
the short answer is I stumbled around and kind of started developing skills that I enjoyed, and then that ended up being a career for me. And I ended up doing there. But there's probably three things that really mattered for me, which was I really loved analytics from an early point. And when you look at the web coming online effectively, more and more things were instrumented so you could analyze them.
Mhm.
So that was like a golden age of data. And I think now it's called big data or whatever. But at the time, it was just like, wow, how do we scale to support this stuff was the issue. But so many interesting insights could happen. Then
Mhm.
I fast forward in time, I got more excited about how that collided with media. And that actually ended up bringing me to Google and Google Video to start with. But Google Video wasn't doing so well. So a few months later, YouTube was acquired. So I raised my hand and I jumped over, and YouTube was the school of my career. At some point, I did basically every product job that was there and eventually rose up the ranks and became a leader at the company. And then, decided after about 8 years that it was time to make a change. And I moved to Europe and I went to Spotify. And I really was excited about, music and artists on that front, but also subscription models. And so that became a school there, but also very different when you move from a place like Google to Spotify. And at that point in time, Spotify was having both Google and Apple compete with it. So it became a really interesting environment where I learned a lot about growth and how scrappy you need to be when it's existential about your company versus, maybe advantages you might have by being pre-installed on Android or pre-installed on Apple, you get a lot of advantages from that perspective. So how do you differentiate and how do you make decisions that are about a great product experience that's 10 times better than anything else? And now you fast forward in time, I've generally always been excited about new ecosystems. So when you really pull the thread on all of this type of things, a lot of what happened in Web 2 was to democratize creativity and then make distribution easier for everyone, especially global distribution. And now with Web 3 and OpenSea, it's also about giving people control over the business model, which I'm really excited about. And it empowers a lot of creators in the world who otherwise might not have a sustainable living or career. So right now, that's what motivates me most.
Yeah, totally. Before we jump into the endless topic of like, Web3 and building a great product,
Yeah.
I want to ask you something personal, right? Like you have such a great career. Like I'm curious, like a couple things, right? Like one is where does your ambition come from? And like, is this like from like where you grew up in your family, or like does it come from like, just like yourself, like throughout the experience you have been successfully doing so many different roles? Like where does ambition come from? And then who is on your personal board of advisors when it comes to career development?
Let me start with the motivation. The motivation is always like from like childhood. I've always just liked to tinker and build things. And anytime, like for me, your imagination can be coupled with your, career and professional
Mhm.
development. That's just a luxury on this planet. And so I've always sought that. And the inspiration for me has always been, oh, can I think of something? Can I make it happen? Can I work with a team to make it come to life? And can I really enjoy that? Who doesn't want to do that? So I'm a very
Mhm.
creative person. And if eventually you have to talk yourself out of your most creative things to make something practical happen. But I love like the art of like getting a plain canvas, drawing or sketching something, building something with Legos, whatever it might be. Even as a kid, I used to just try to imagine those things. So now having a career where you can do that every day and solve problems for other people is I mean, it's a dream come true, and I feel so blessed and honored for that. So that's one. In terms of mentors, like I've been really lucky. Like I've just had a series of managers and friends around me who were complimentary, always gave me really good feedback. And anytime like I would want to do something stupid or something great, they'd give me feedback. And sometimes I'd still do
Mhm.
something stupid. And, I got lucky to do some things that were great. So, but it's a range of different people. And I think what's really important to me is like there's no like specific set of one or two mentors for me. It's always been get mentorship from everyone around you and only join organizations or teams that can make you stronger. That's always been my motivation. So a lot of people think about jobs in terms of like, what product do I want to work on? I look at it
Mhm.
from the perspective of, one is what's the mission of the company? A great mission really matters. But the people is the next thing I look at. Are these people I can really engage with and learn from? And then third thing is I look at product. Some of the best mentorships I had were people who, when I was working on enterprise analytics, and people like I was probably bored every day of the job I was doing, but I was surrounded by such incredible people. I learned so much through the journey, and that's really important to me.
Totally. I'm curious, like, do you try to find people who are similar to you, or do you feel like you should find someone who is like kind of complementary to you?
I think it's very important to find people that are complementary to you. The key thing in order to get the mentorship and feedback is to
Mhm.
agree on the interface by which that can happen. I'll
Mhm.
give you an example. So, when I was early on, and I really didn't know anything about like speaking to the press or product marketing and all this type of stuff, right? And so I had a great mentor who's like, look, I'm going to throw you out there. You're going to figure it out. But that person did these like dress rehearsals with me all the time and really gave me a safe spot one on one so I wouldn't get too nervous, right? And I'd go through my pitch, I'd go through my deck, right? I'd talk about why we were doing things, and they would just tear me apart. But it was a safe space. And it's something that I just like hold as a management philosophy now, which is in a safe space, knives out, hug it out, right? It's really important. It makes you stronger. And it was almost like athletic coaching where, you don't want your, tennis coach to do an annual review with you, right? You want them to give you feedback all the time. But you want to do it in a safe spot, right? Where you can be hypercritical, but not be threatened or shamed publicly per se. So that was really important to me. And in some cases, like it's about what's most comfortable for you. So for example, you might say, I'm going to write down my thoughts and how I'm thinking about it. I'm going to put it into a doc because I'm better at that than verbalizing it. And can you give me feedback in a structured way in that doc? So what is important is like have diversity around you, but come up with common ways to have those interfaces. And a lot of times when we first join a company or get a new manager or get a new team, we don't take the time to talk about how would you like feedback? How would I like feedback? If you could have that discussion up front, it's very powerful and it encourages people to give you feedback without feeling awkward about it.
Totally. I'm curious, like when it comes to shaping your like strength, what do you consider as your unfair advantage, and what is a skill that you're constantly trying to get better at?
Yeah. Okay. So one is if given the time, I can usually think about things not just as a feature, but as an ecosystem. I spend a lot of my time thinking about, okay, to make this thing work, awesome, but what can we do reciprocally so that creators benefit, such that users benefit, and that works in a loop? So that's really important to me. A lot of times we spend too much time on, where the button is and what it needs to do and how usable it is, and we don't think about the feedback mechanisms behind it. I think it's really like when you see places like Apple and you see places like, YouTube, for example, and Spotify as well. It's not just about the features, it's the rewards for the creators, or it's the fact that this feature really works well as part of an ecosystem of devices. Really spending time to think about that is as important as designing that feature in isolation. So I think that's really important. Second thing, which I've gotten good at over recent history, is just being much better at design and removing clutter and focusing on tasks and making it simple and easy to use. When we get into technology, ideally in the early days, it was really just about getting it live, but was it ugly and funky across the board? In our world, like design should be an advantage, but simplicity focuses you not on just usability, it focuses you on what's most important. And in a world of clutter and too much media and too much going on, getting that clutter out and prioritizing things, I think is really important. And then occasionally you can progressively reveal something really complex. But having that razor is really important, and I've gotten very good at that. And then the third thing, which I'm still trying to improve on, is making sure that I prioritize what's most important versus maybe what's most fun for me personally. And I'm learning this in Web3, which is there's just so much basic infrastructure and so much of a basic set of primitives that need to be invented. As much as might want to leapfrog way into the future, if we can solve these basic problems now, that future will be possible. If we ignore these basic problems now, I saw the comment on this, security is a really good example. If we can solve those right now, then we can create a world that's better for people. But if we ignore those things, then that future world is not going to be possible. So we have to be patient and solve the hard problems, not just the fun problems. And that's really important to me now. And it's really something that when I wake up in the morning, I've got to look in the mirror and make sure I'm doing that, because my tendency is to move into the more creative areas.
Totally. I'm curious when it comes to like, I totally agree with you on like, the removing part. I think like I think to figure out what not to do is like basically like a huge part of the job. So to I'm just curious, like after you've been through like, you've worked at like so many iconic products and companies, how did it shape how you think? Because I feel like each company is like having really different products, and then as someone who work on so many different products, what is the essence that you took from these great companies? Like we're not talking about like a specific product, but more like the lessons that you've gain from like, being an insider of these top companies?
Okay, the most important thing for me is remembering when to be intuition driven versus data driven.
Mhm.
And too many companies are one or the other. I think there's a lot of companies that are fantastic at optimizing things, but they are not great at inventing things. And and I think partially that's just because they don't get into the right frame of mind at the right stage of product development. So, for example, right now at OpenSea, I think there's a lot of really basic things we can do, which good design can solve a problem and we can get it out there and learn. And the faster we move, the better off we are. Because these problems are real, these opportunities are real, and we need to see if we can help people resolve them or do something more easily or help a creator or a developer get exposure faster. And that's super interesting. Now, later, we might spend a lot of time saying, wow, everything's working really well, and we've got to optimize things, in isolation, and you move to more of a data-driven model. But I think the one thing about the great companies in the world is they know when they are intuition-driven and when to use data to their advantage. But it's never usually that it's just one of these things works. So that's very, very important to me. As you can imagine, every company can benefit from data. It can give you ideas. But I'm not sure if a lot of the things we see today would have been invented if you had just looked at your logs all day. You got to talk to people, you got to play with prototypes, you got to form a strong opinion about what is designed well and does it work for the job. And you can do that viscerally without necessarily having to rely on a spreadsheet to inform that decision. So that's one, it's very important. The second thing I think is super important right now is that, most products are increasingly not just about a utility or tool, it's about an ecosystem of a bunch of creators out there. And if you just optimize, for example, based on how people use the tool, but you don't look at the system of creators, contributors, freelancers, whoever is out there that you're helping to provide a service, then you're missing a big opportunity. And I won't finger point, but I've worked at companies where they ignore that ecosystem, and I've worked at companies that embrace that ecosystem. And if you embrace that ecosystem, when you test something new or you try something new, you want to look at winners and losers in the ecosystem too, not just winners and losers in usage. And if you start to look at those winners and losers in the ecosystem, it becomes really exciting on that front. And you can say, wow, do I want these players to be successful with me? And can I commit to that? Then it's not just about changing your product, it's about changing the types of things they can do in your community. And that really matters.
Totally. I'm curious, like, because of you've worked in like so many different industries, curious, like, how do you quickly become an expert in a completely different zone, right? Like, like talk about Spotify, it's about music, and then like, Apple, it's about, the tech and design. And, nowadays, like OpenSea is about like Web3 and crypto. Like, how do you educate yourself to become an expert right away?
So sometimes, and this might seem a little dull a little bit, but sometimes the best thing to understand a new industry is to put together a little spreadsheet and understand this company and understand all the inputs it has that relate to revenue, engagement, etc. But what you're trying to study is like all the different inputs that lead up to that. And that tells you a really interesting story. So if you look, for example, right, like if you look at a place like Spotify or you look at many, true marketplaces, you're really trying to understand, oh, wow, if we have, we've got all the world's music there, but you start to realize that maybe personalization starts to lead to more engagement. And you start to realize that, wow, it's not just about music, but it's also about owning moments and context. So therefore, you might actually move from music to podcasts. And we think that's really about owning more listening or engagement time. You start to just develop an idea of like, oh, what can we do next? And that's going to ultimately lead to more subscribers, right? And more time spent and more revenue and all that good stuff. But if you go back to the inputs that are driving that, that's a great way to understand any kind of business. Sometimes it's a public company and you want to step back and read like what are the key metrics that they're talking about. That's usually just not enough, right? But one of the key things you can do is just speak with people in an industry or a company and ask them, hey, what are the 5 things you do that eventually just move the needle for this company? Write them down, ask questions about them, understand why those levers matter. Try to think about which levers don't exist that they could pull. That's a really good thought exercise and lets you go up the curve very quickly.
When it comes to like, not only like, just like study the new industry, but also like, I guess like growing a team and then like being familiar with like the players in the industry,
Mhm.
how do you, I guess, like quickly build up a new network? Nowadays, like you have been in the tech industry overall for so
Mhm.
long. So like I'm sure you have like a really solid network. But growing a new team, especially let's say like, OpenSea, I believe a year ago you guys only have like less than 100 people. Now it's like over 450 people um over like the time of like a year. So um how do you kind of like put together your team, and do you look for these people in Web3 to educate them on product, or do you look for uh I guess like a product expert and
Mhm.
transform them into like a Web3 expert?
So it's a mix of both. I think we need people who are, Web3 native and
Mhm.
understand this really well. And it's basically because like it is a complex space, and to have like empathy and solve some of these problems, like starting cold can be hard. But you also get some really incredible skills from Web 2 that just may not be in Web 3 yet. So for example, recommendation systems, right? Or trust and safety types of things. And like looking for, various types of content and classifying content, etc., could be really interesting capabilities to have. And so therefore, I think it's just a mix of the two. And then once you have a mix of the two, what you really need to emphasize is how do these people learn from each other? And one of the big things that we're focused on is like, how can we get people together in person, spend time together, have time to jam together, and learn from each other? That doesn't happen in structured meetings. That happens when you're sitting side by side in safe places and being able to like talk about stuff and learn from each other and do that over, a you know, some food, right? Do it while you're walking to get a coffee, whatever it might be. But you need that kind of like ethos. So one of the key things is that if you're in a space that's moving so fast, like we are in right now, your speed to educating new people is really important, as well as your speed of effectively executing and launching things to the community is very
Mhm.
important because you learn faster in those cases. And in order to make that happen, we really, really do need people to like jam together. I think that's so, so important. Otherwise, you're inefficient. Now, you can also do that remote, you can do that in person, you can do it in many different ways, but whatever org model you have to hyper optimize for fast education for new people so they can learn from each other. And as a result, what we also try to do is like when we're interviewing people, if they do come from Web 2 and they have no exposure to Web 3, I try to make sure that they spend some time understanding, hey, here's what I've learned in Web 2. What changes when I go to Web 3? Like it's sometimes you have a lot of people in Web 2 are used to proprietary lockdown data. When you first start talking about the fact that, well, actually all of our data is effectively public. You can see it on the blockchain, you can analyze it. What changes about how you think about building a competitive moat in your world? What changes in terms of the types of people you can work with to analyze that data? What changes about how your competitors are going to use that data, right? And what opportunities arise because you don't need to have all that data in a proprietary way to learn from it. If you look at all of those things, I like to see people get really creative about taking their Web 2 roots and bringing them to Web 3. And that's also very important in terms of screening who might be a great employee here.
Totally. When you are thinking about like, I guess like building a product or product team in Web3 and Web2, what do you think are the differences and like similarities?
Well, the similarities I think are all about how we work together, right? And like I said, jam together, design together, etc., all this type of stuff. And that's really important. The other similarities are, I believe in I have different preference. For example, like I don't like long slide decks. I like, simple dots to describe things. I'd rather play with a mock than talk about it in words ahead of time. Like those are the things that I bring culturally to the team. And I think those are just things that I've succeeded with, and I think is important for us to do. But there's another side of it. Like what's different is that one, it's super early, and it's a very lumpy environment. So you can't come in here and like never talk to a creator. You can't come in here and not join a bunch of communities to learn from it. You need to like really go into the ecosystem. There's a lot of people I think who come from Web 2 who are almost consciously told not to go engage with the community, right? And that's not good, right? We've got to like be out there. We've got to be there on Twitter and Discord, whatever it might be, learning from each other. And you can get that feedback in real time. You can get it in, authentic ways. So if you don't have that muscle, right, or you're scared to use that muscle, it's time that you need to shed that. And so one very important thing to me is just that exposure and engagement really matters, because the things we do are affecting, artistic creation or sustainability of those artists to do very fascinating things. But if you're not understanding what you're doing or what their needs are, then you're missing, an opportunity to learn and deliver a real impact.
I think, for example, I chatted with the co-founder of like Xfinity. So basically, their game is like basically a lot of the ideas are took from the community. The community instantly gave them feedback. But since OpenSea is like a platform, marketplace platform, so I think it's really hard to just like take every single feedback. I'm curious, like, how do you guys like come up with like particular features or things that like you guys decided to build? And also like, compared to Web 2, a lot of the people who created a company are based on like an existing problem that they're trying to solve in the real world. But right now, like because Web 3 is so new, like I think you have to imagine like how a lot of situation exists in the Web 3 space. Curious, like, how do you kind of like quickly identify what is the feature that you're going to build?
Well, first, the community does have a ton of relevant feedback. I think it's really about, understanding who that audience is and making sure that we're listening to them and kind of giving them, like, for example, we just launched our new protocol, Seaport. And a big part of that is that we need a contract out there that can allow us to do things that, heavy collectors really want. For example, the ability to do a collection level offer, for example. And that's really important to them, right? Like they don't want to do it on an individual item basis. They're really interested in things that might be at a particular level of rarity. How can I actually just make that one buy and not have to think too much, and also do it less expensively with less gas? So when you put those things together, we can learn a lot from the community, because the community is basically often doing things on spreadsheets or manually that they would like to see automated in our product. And they would like to see it automated at a lower cost, right? With better data around it. So spending time with them, like I've sat around some people and just watched them as they're looking at NFTs and what purchases they want to make and what data they're using to make that purchase. It's incredibly valuable just to do that. And I remember going down this rabbit's hole for like 6 hours, just like, how do you wake up every morning? What do you look at? Like, which sites do you go to? And you start to get a pattern of what these folks need. Now, to your point, there's another group of users that is still trying to figure out what this is all about, right? And so that forces us to spend more time on a product and design level. What is the real utility of this? And are we doing a good job of merchandising that utility? Is the experience to like tease it out or consume it clear on OpenSea or not? And maybe occasionally find an opportunity to invent something there. In other words, no one's going to tell you exactly what they want because they don't know yet, but they are confused. So I also look for moments of confusion or opportunities to drive consideration. And then we step back and we need to like brainstorm. This is like the path that we need to do a lot more work on. Like I said, I'm really excited about going down this journey, but we do need to solve the table stakes first, right? And so that's really important. But eventually we'll be doing both.
Totally. When you think about like, how people use NFT now versus like how people are gonna use NFT in the future,
Mm-hmm.
there is, I guess, two questions around it. One is like on in like a bigger picture, how do you take NFT mainstream? So when I think about NFT right now, I can just think of like, PFP. So I personally categorize them in like three categories. So one is utility. So for example, there are startups that are using like NFT as like identity check. So when you log onto the internet, they serve as like an entry point, basically doing an ID check for you. So you don't have to log into everything to verify everything. And then number two
Yeah.
is like the brand building side. For example, Budweiser, like Nike, Adidas, these like iconic brands, they're transforming their culture online, right? Like they wanted to kind of interact with their audience in a even more like interact with their super fan in a way. And
Mm-hmm.
the other one is like basically for fun, right? Like people changing their profile picture into like a cat or something. So curious, like for these three group of audience, I think like the transactional value are very different, right? Like for example, brand building, if your brand is sold at like Prada or something, like it's really easy to have like a larger transaction when it comes to like the revenue stream, right? Like, and then when you think about like the fun PFP, although we have the top projects like Bored Ape, but the majority product are sold in like 0.3 ether or something, like, so it's like not like as significant as like the bigger brands. And in terms of utility, it is very, in the future maybe it's going to be very, very useful, but right now like not everyone is online. Like how do you kind of go about the taking the NFT mainstream from a revenue standpoint and from like a how useful a product is like standpoint?
Yeah, I think it all comes down to utility, but maybe to abstract it a little bit is like, what does an NFT represent, right? As something that
Mhm,
I go back to. What are the primitives that are possible as a result? Well, the first and foremost, it can be a piece of art, right? So you can
mhm,
have inherent value around that. You can have self-expression value. In other words, I want this identity, and now it's my Twitter profile, and that all has real value for people. The second piece is that it's a community I'm a part of, and this is the most important one. And why it's important is that community now is not just membership in that community, but there's like a business model around it too.
mhm,
And that business model is very different in Web3 because if you looked at Web2, it was largely about monetizing attention. Okay.
mhm,
In other words, you're a creator, you build a big audience, they come and watch your stuff, and then you slap an impression, right? An ad impression on the stuff, and you make money off of it. Gradually, that morphed into subscriptions, right? But for the most part, the person who might be your fan, who's contributing to that economy, makes it a lovely place for people to join as a community, gets no benefit out of it, right?
mhm,
So that becomes really lopsided in some ways, which is creators are not incented in that prior world to do deep things in the community because it's way better for them to create 10,000 more videos and amass a larger audience. So they spend all their time creating and not as much engaging. So in our world, what ends up shifting is that you can create a better balance there. And so you start with that basic thesis. What becomes interesting is to step back and say, okay, what's a creator with a great audience? What would they love to see their community doing to help make their community a thriving place? And how can they reward that community now? So it might be first you jumped into the community by purchasing an NFT and you got this membership, but you might airdrop something to them, right? Like some new NFT that's just like, here's a reward. You might let that NFT effectively allow them to purchase merchandise, exclusive merchandise, which leads to self-expression value. But it could also just be that, well, people are doing really interesting things here, and I want to give them the VIP version of my NFT,
mhm,
right? And and I can reward that for them. And they, if they want, could resell that NFT as well for economic value. But and the creator now benefits by having potentially a royalty fee on all of those resales. So the more they're investing in the community, the greater the value of people participating in that community, and the pie is bigger for everyone, including the creator. That is a loop that's really interesting. So when I look at the stuff going mainstream, I look at those mechanics and say, what kinds of groups, what kinds of creators could benefit from that type of ecosystem, and which ones will invest more in that, And can there be millions of such communities in the future is something that I want to learn over the next year, right? And
Totally.
the answer might be maybe, maybe not, but
Mhm.
I do think there's more than 10, right?
Mhm.
And I do think there's, probably less than a billion. But let's see what happens in between and make sure that that's more seamless for people to understand. They understand the value of the community. They know how to find a good one. And hopefully more of their creators that they already have a lot of fanship for effectively start to do this stuff, and we'll learn together.
Totally. I'm curious, like, what's your thought on the owning the community piece, right? Like, there is DAOs out
Hmm.
there is like bunch of Discord groups. I feel like one of the things that OpenSea did great is like, creating this platform for people to
Hmm.
showcase their work. But I think the community piece is like still like on a separate platform. I'm curious, like, how do you kind of because I think all the monetization could be within the Discord group, right? Like, people transact like, people having the conversation about, like, "Can I purchase your, NFT?" Or, like, the engagement are still on a separate platform. How do you kind of, like, control the power of, the user, like, doing the engagement piece, like, on your platform instead of just using it as a transaction because there's less glue in there, right?
Yeah, I think right. We're still figuring out like which pieces matter. We created Seaport, our protocol layer, so that other people can have this commerce platform and build around it. And I think
Mhm,
it's really important to be open there. One argument is that depending on the type of community you have, you might want to have that type of engagement happen in different ways. And I
mhm,
do believe that. I'm a little worried about like a one size fits all kind of
mhm,
dimension because then you all just kind of end up being a chat group, right? The lowest common denominator wins.
mhm.
So what I would say is right now I'm more interested in how do people know what's going on in that community and whether it's useful for them and relevant for them.
Mhm,
And that goes all the way down to letting people know like what we're focused on is like this is, the verified collection, right? And this is a real owner of it. And here's information about how that's, trending over time. That way you've got a safe doorway into that community. And if we can do that job really well, I'm confident we can potentially do other things in the future. But I do think we need to do that really well right now. And then the other side of it is like creators are still figuring out what tools, what capabilities they need in order to serve that community. And if there's primitives that make sense that we could expose in our API or data that we could provide in a more usable way, we'll help them with that. But I think it's very early to step back and say that there's one size fits all for engagement.
When you join OpenSea, because you come from like bigger organizations, right? Like, how do you
Yeah.
kind of establish a system within the company? Because like running a product team is very different than like, you and I working on a two people startup, right?
Mhm.
How do you basically like 100x what they have? Um,
Mhm.
like as like a team, as like a, like functioning product organization.
The main thing for me is just like you have to learn what's going on and what are the problems or opportunities. Um, a lot of people jump into things with a very rigid playbook that works for them.
Mhm,
I've never had a rigid playbook, and I've got some rules, I've got some principles that I like believe in, but I feel like you've got to morph it to the environment and the company you're in. But the goal with that is to step back and jointly with the team and leadership is define the rituals that matter.
mhm,
And so, for example, we do believe in like early on, like creating product reviews to talk about the problems we're trying to solve, why we're trying to solve them, and prioritize them. Why do we do that up front? Is so that teams can run freely with
mhm,
autonomy and accountability against that. That's really important to me. So that's one example of a ritual that we might have. We just did some major launches, right? And so, one of the teams basically said, "Hey, we're going to drop an NFT to everyone in that team, and that's going to be a ritual we have."
mhm.
Pretty cool, And so it's very uniquely Web3, uniquely for NFTs, and so that's super fun. So what I think is most important to do is not just bring a system to something, but see where we need structure, where we need alignment, and then put the basics in place to make that happen. The other
Mm,
thing that's really important is just providing time for people to do their job well. The problem in a high energy startup often is that high accountability, we want high execution, but do you have time to think? So just making sure that every once in a while we step back and say, well, let's explore something. We don't know what the solution is. Rather than to sprint to the obvious thing all the time, let's provide a little bit of breathing room for the more complicated or debatable aspects of what we do. And then make sure we all get together in a room and, duke it out and debate and then hug it out when we're done. That's really important as well. So in terms of scaling, the most important thing for me to do versus many big companies is just make sure everyone knows that they have high impact. And
mhm,
if they can make this product or service better, they should just do it. Okay.
mhm.
And not ask for permission, etc. If they need guidance, it's a different thing. If they need a sparring partner to explore something, fantastic. But we need to work together fast, right? Do things elegantly with polish, and then debate the things that end up being, these true one-way doors that you have to walk through.
Totally. How do you differentiate OpenSea versus like their competitors? Because nowadays like all the top crypto exchange started like picking up on the NFT games. Curious, how do you um think about the differentiation, right? Like what type of market do you feel like you need to go after?
Mhm,
And then like, there's so many different type of NFT. For example, like, today we're using like a event NFT to kind of like helping
mhm.
people collect that like the attendance. And there is also music NFT and there's like a bunch of different format of NFTs. Like um I feel like OpenSea is still very, very known for like the PFP related things. How do you think about that diversification compared to your competitors?
To the main way we're focused, right? And I know this might seem glib, it's just we have a real already audience that's using us today.
Mhm,
So as I mentioned earlier, give them the features they need, right? And make sure we're servicing them well and move as fast as possible as we can to do that. So that's really important. The second piece of it is create a good space for these really creative, inventive people to make sure that when they do publish on OpenSea, that there isn't like 10 copy mints out there for their work. That if it's really important and they get spoofed a lot, that we give them the verified account and a collection badge to make sure that people know this is the authentic one. And then fixing usability issues that might be tied to misunderstanding or security, etc. So right now, I think what our biggest thing is like let's move fast on these real basic things that make sure we deserve to be where we are, right? And keep earning the trust of that community. Now, the other side of it is to step back and say, what should we be doing down the line? But
mhm,
I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. Like, I think it's really important in this space to look 3 months ahead, but
mhm,
looking 3 years ahead is very hard, right? We keep
mhm.
learning something every 6 weeks. That's important. So what we've done is really step back and said, like, let's move, against the known obvious things. And I'm sure over time our aperture can get wider because we've learned and we solved some of these problems. And then more opportunities will come to us. At the end of the side is, we create pixels, right? We move them around, we create cool features behind them. We create a lot of complexity that we try to abstract, right, through the work we do with our UI and smart contracts. And ultimately, I think that'll be a good foundation to build richer experiences. But we do need to focus on the basics. So when I think about, I don't really spend a lot of time, frankly, thinking about competition because just by listening to our users and seeing what they need, I've got a pretty healthy roadmap right now, right?
Mhm.
And so if we could just really move fast on that, and I think everyone's going to be excited, and we'll go from there.
How do you like kind of tap into your do you have an ideal user base or do you have like
Hmm.
a number of people that like share the same characteristic, for example, age, gender, or like the geolocation that they are
Hmm.
in? Like, how do you kind of merge them into one? Because, trying to gain for example, when you're running a podcast or something, you have a target group of audience and
Hmm.
there is like your actual audience. How do you kind of like make them more closely aligned?
Uh, so it's really been interesting. Like, we don't. it's Web3. We don't have the classical ways to
Mhm.
segment your audience. There's no demographics, right? We
Mhm.
we often don't know the identity, right? We might have a wallet address effectively. But what is interesting is to look at, you know, really what you're looking at is kind of like folks who are curious about this and folks who are clearly passionate about it. And just looking at that behaviorally, right? I think one of our things is like there's a very concentrated group of people that's super excited about NFTs. They collect them, they create them, right? Big drops happen, they have surges of activity, etc. We can do a lot better there. And then the question is like, okay, what are people who are curious about this? May also be crypto native and new to NFTs, but how can we start to tease out opportunities to get them, sort of buying their first one or buying their second one? And that one's more experimental. We're learning a lot about what matters there. And so that's really in the learn kind of stage, whereas the established ones are really in the execution phase. We know what we need to do for these. So those two balancing acts become interesting. I think there's a lot to do on both sides, but probably the most important thing is that once we see people who are passionate about a project, we can
Mhm.
just look at that project and see how it's doing and talk to those creators, and they have a good sense of who their community is. So that goes back to why it's so important to engage with the community, because we're not going to see that in our logs, but we're going to see it when we talk to them and join discords and participate in the community. We get a lot of ideas about what we need to do.
What what makes a NFT project successful? Is that actually the utility? Because I don't see a lot of like top project have much of a utility until recently, right?
I think it's a sense of belonging for many people. I think we do have to remember in today's world that a sense of belonging really is missing for a lot of people. And they have a chance to reinvent themselves in these communities. They have a sense to show their artistic talent. Like I said earlier, it could be rewarded as well.
Mhm.
And ultimately, they find a community of peers that makes them, feel excited about waking up every morning and talking about stuff. And those people aren't just meeting digitally, they're meeting in real life, right? And forming new friends. And I think that's what's most exciting about this, right? Which is in there's so much of Web 2, which is focused on sitting in front of a screen and just entertaining yourself.
Mhm.
And in this world, what's really exciting to see is that the group and the communion in that group is the first thing, even before a project is created, right? You get into the group, the mint hasn't even happened yet, and you'll have 5,000 people in this group talking about it and coming up with ideas and voting on things and teasing out things and, getting to know each other. So that inversion, I think, is really what's most important here. So if we can take a sense of belonging, and then that belonging is economically rewarded through the co-creation, then you start to get into utility, which is like, what else do I get out of this, right? And what real life events do I get? What digital expression aspects do I have? How does maybe a hobby I had actually start to come to life in this world where my real job doesn't let me do that? Those are the things that I think are powerful in Web3.
Do you think their internet identity and the real life identity will coexist, or do you think people will like slowly shifting towards like purely focusing on their digital identity?
I think it's really just depends, right? Like I think it depends so much on the person and what is their relationship with their own identity and their community, and how much is this liberating for them, or how much of it is a companion to their actual real life. I could imagine a world where people have multiple identities based on the context in the future. There are certain situations that I enter where I really wouldn't want someone to know, for example, where I work. I just don't want to. I go into certain situations. I don't want
Mhm.
to talk about my work all day, right? And
Mhm.
so, but in many cases, that's obviously an essential part of who I am, and also what people want to learn about. And I'm there for that specific purpose. So I think the most interesting thing here is actually your ability to choose your identity based on the context versus whether these things merge. And for many people, that might sit on one side of the spectrum here.
Totally. They're speaking of, the co-creation with the audience. Some of the audience have some question about, uh basically they may encounter like scam in the NFT markets in general. And recently there is also this news about like the former OpenSea exec who, have like insider trading sort of like situation happen. So curious on these like negative related news, like what is, as like a leading platform, like what are something that you guys are gonna do about these situations? And from a personal like curiosity, like I spoke with Magic Eden founders, so they're gonna just like double check on the project before a project like launch on top of their platform. So compared to these kind of more centralized approach, like what is you guys thought on like, OpenSea as a platform to, making sure people don't constantly getting scammed, but also, having some room for people to have the flexibility to do these like to launch the project they want to.
Yeah, we definitely believed in like decentralized creativity, right? Like, I don't think like having gatekeepers on that in the world of Web3 makes a lot of sense. But what we are doing, as you can see with a lot of the recent announcements we've made, is making sure that creator effectively is authentic, right? And also it's very clear when they are authentic which collections they own, and putting that blue check mark on things when we can validate that, so that when you get to something you can see that. We recently, for example, also made it, possible to use OAuth to like show your Twitter account. And we're moving forward with other social connections. So you can see the official verified account tied to that collection. And if you want to go check out that community, you can go do that and spend some time there before making a purchase. So putting this, and then the final system is for these, you know, verified collections effectively. So verified accounts and badge collections. As I mentioned before, we've got this nice net of looking for copy mints associated with that. So you don't have all this spoofing behavior. And then of course there's more work we're doing as well to just look at, like just make sure that, hey, are we seeing
Mhm.
anything suspicious? We need to act on it, right? So I think it's very important for us to look at ourselves as, a trusted portal on top of Web3.
Mhm.
And of course, there's a lot of things that can happen out there that are, people publish things and it's fantastic, right? But when you go through OpenSea and you're effectively looking at this world on the blockchain, we are a layer that guides you to the best of what's happening. But it we don't dictate like what's the best, right? We don't want to curate for you. What we want is to make sure that when you do find something you like, you can make sure that the owner is effectively real, right?
Mhm.
And you aren't landing accidentally on a collection that's spoofing something that we've identified as authentic.
How do you check who is the owner? As like nowadays, everybody's identity is so vague, and especially in the Web3 world, like everyone's like uh, a vector, basically. How do you kind of like fact check that they are the creator, though?
One of the key things is like there's so many interesting metrics in these communities, right? So you're right. It might be really easy to like fake like an identity, but it's really hard to fake a community. It is. And if you like, again, you come to a collection, you see the official Discord, you go sit in it for a while, and there's 10,000 people participating, and it's clear they're not bots, right? Like that's really important. Well, okay, something is real here. I can go like taste that experience and then come back and make a choice. So that is very important to us, which is, if you look at like what Google did with like PageRank and like
Mhm.
backlinks and all these things to rank that stuff, I'm a big believer we have this opportunity for community rank around these collections. And
Mhm.
we can expose that, we can learn from it, and we'll have to get better over time. This is something that, as you get to smaller things, you still want them to have like their moment of sunshine too. But we have to get better at like what metrics matter and what is a proof of authenticity. But I do agree with you. It's not just because someone was seen on TV that they are authentic. It needs to be that they authentically created a community that's clearly participating and feels really good about the place that they're in.
How do you like besides like how frequently people are chatting in a Discord group, what are some measurements to like to kind of have a bar for the community, right? Like what exactly is a good community? I don't think chatting all the time makes a good community, because people could be just chatting about, like, for example, let's say, like, on WeChat, like we have like a socks buying community, like everybody buys
Mhm.
socks, and then like it's a great community, but it's also like we don't know each other more than we're purchasing the same thing, right? Like, and
Mhm.
like, there's no meaningful exchange about like personal information, or like you don't really know about the other person's story, but you're like in a group that's very active. And versus, a lot of the community that, we also have like a 10 people LinkedIn group and like a little small WhatsApp group, and then like we chat all the time about like Web3. So it's like very small, but it's like very engaging. We're sharing
Yep.
meaningful information about each other. So curious, like what are the bars for a good community? And the second question is about, like, from a general like brand standpoint, like, there's a lot of big brands. For example, Chipotle like just started like, taking crypto for like 3,000 of their store, like 2,950 technically. So like basically they're taking 98 different type of cryptocurrency. So you can purchase a burrito in that. And but like, but before that, they were launching on Roblox. Like you can just like play, you're like kind of in a Chipotle store or something. But like, or like, on the fashion side of things, like there's like a lot of top brands that are selling digital sneakers, which like kind of don't really make sense for me, because like I feel like I buy a sneaker, like partially it's because of the look, but the other part is because I can wear it. Like there is some sort of actual utility to it. Like I don't really know how can a brand authentically translate that into like the Web3 experience. I'm curious, like since you're the expert, like how would you approach as a brand to like create an experience that you can't really experience offline?
Well, let me answer both questions and just start by like, I'm not the expert. Like, I think we're all learning. Okay. Like, I feel like we're going to learn so much more in the next 6 months than what any of us know over the last 6 years about the space. So, but, but let me start with I can't give you a formula for community, and I'm not going to pretend to. I think we're still learning, right? And we're going to have to learn by, you know, thinking about what are these communities, what's their purpose, right? What is the right indicator of whether it's successful or thriving or not? I think that's a very hard problem. So one of our key things will be to just like spend more time learning before we make hasty decisions. So let me put that one aside because it's a very hard one to completely answer right now. But there's no like heuristic that says yes automatically. And I think there are some obvious cases where we can start to do better. So we'll proceed down the path, learn together. On what can a brand do? I mean, I feel like with any new revolution in the world, every brand has always found a way to tell their authentic story in the new world. And it's not just like technologically speaking, it's culturally speaking, what's resonant, the way to talk about yourself, etc. Like when I look at, you know, the direct to consumer brands that started on YouTube, right, and really built their audience there. And I'm sure there's a bunch of ones that then started on Facebook and did something different. And now in Web3, people are creating community first and working backwards about what they should even build. I think there's a lot of like exploration here. But I remember when like the Dollar Shave Club video came out on YouTube and it was really funny and it was sort of long, right? It wasn't your traditional advertisement and it went viral, right? And it created effectively $1 billion company, I think. And so, but people will find a way, right?
Mhm.
I think what's really important in this world is that there's more ways, right, and more authentic ways to tell your story as a brand and connect with people. What I'm really excited about are what are the brands that lean most into community mechanics. So it's not just like a one-way media. I don't just throw out the video and hope it was successful and then I measure that with surveys and stuff like that. I think it's going to be the folks who are like, I've got a community manager now, I've got a community team. They're sitting here, they're learning about what they should do. And they're not just learning to see if they were successful with their branding message, they're learning to figure out what they should be doing from product development or customer service and really, really being a part of their audience or their customers. So that is probably going to unveil a whole bunch of recipes in the world. And I think brands are going to learn from the best Web3 communities, including PFP communities, to figure out what they should be doing. And then hopefully they'll take it to the next level.
One last real quick question before we jump into a 1 minute fire round, which is, um what exactly is the job of a community manager? As you know, in the past, we talk about like social media manager. Nowadays, like all the tech company or like all the company in general, like they are
Mhm.
all media companies, right? Like, you know, you see like Duolingo, Chipotle, they're like crazy on TikTok, like and like curious. But now it's like not just like one or two people on a team, I assume. It's like basically you're running a media agency within your own company, right? Like so curious about the community management part since community is such a big part of Web3. Um, besides, you know, responding to Discord managers and stuff like that, like I mean, like manage Discord or like like DMing people back or something. Like, what exactly
Mhm.
can they do to create an engaging community?
Well, it depends on the brand and the community, but one is like, what are the rituals in the community? Like,
Mhm.
what types of things do people want to engage? What's the cadence of those? What's the calendar of those things? That's one. Two is how do you create a healthy, safe space, right? Like each community has a different culture. They have norms of communication. What are the rules of engagement? Like that's super important to enforce. Otherwise, things can go into dark places. And so it's really important to also defend that stuff. And then finally, I think it's just that you are chatting and you are talking and you're going live. So what voice do you want to have, right? Like, are you super serious and analytical? Or are you jovial and having fun with things? Are you encouraging the community to participate? Or are you one way or two way? Like all these things really matter. So I would step back and say, I think this is like really, really lovely canvas that people are going to play in. And I think the rule books are still being written. Like, and you could see this when you join a Discord community, for example, like, you know, there's a set of channels and there's stuff you go through,
Mhm.
etc. And occasionally someone will do something really interesting in that. You're like, ooh, that's pretty cool. Should learn from it, you know? And I think each brand is going to figure out this playbook. So I don't know like what's the right way to say what's best. Probably right now, though, the most important thing is someone who can learn, like try something, learn and experiment, see if it works. And if it works, do it again. So it's not someone who's got like this static rule book. It's someone who's coming in and being more experimental with what engages the community versus just assuming that there's like a playbook and a checklist that I need to go down.
1 minute fire round. First question: what's your favorite book?
Favorite book, the Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay. That's what
Oh
it's
my
called.
god,
Yeah,
that's specific. I'll search it.
yeah.
Who made the biggest impact in your career?
Who made it? Again, I would like to single out a couple people, but the truth is, it's like 10 people. So I will just say this for all of my managers out there. I I have just been so lucky over the last 10 years where every single one of you had an impact on me, and I'm really appreciative of it. And then I've been surrounded by just sensational colleagues. So I really do have to say that very lucky on that front.
Awesome. Who would you invite to your dinner party?
Oof. David Lynch would be one. I'd love to have Susan Sarandon there. I think there's just like Parker Posey. There's just like a lot of like oddball characters where I'm a big fan of like independent film and also
Mhm.
um, just like quirky poetry. You know, I'd probably kill to have some hip hop stars there like Kendrick Lamar. Um, I mean, there's so much. I think I would just be so embarrassed to sit at that table. But I'd love to observe them talking. That's the truth.
I feel you. So where can we find you outside of work?
Outside of work, so I would say three different places. One is I just recently moved to New York last week, so I
Last week.
would every weekend I'll be running in Central Park or something. It's like a childhood dream. I love it. I think it's just beautiful, but also just the people watching is amazing. In a perfect world, you'd see me like in swimming near water at the beach. I just love water, and I think I don't think I can go swim in the river over here, but I definitely will take a trip now and then to do that. And then finally, I mean, a lot of my time, increasingly, I hope, will be spent like roaming like New York, and that's both food and like a lot of the cool art galleries you can just walk into. That type of inspiration is really really meaningful to
Amazing. Thank you so much, Shiva, for coming on the
me.
show
Yeah,
today.
totally.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. If you enjoyed today's episode, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out. Have a wonderful day.